good morning, everyone. Goodwill is the monarch of this house. Men and women unacquainted. They enter, they shake hands, and they exchange greetings, and they depart friends. It's because cordiality exists among all who abide within. Good morning, Black New Mexico. My name is Scott Carruthers, Executive Director of the New Mexico State Office of African American Affairs, where we provide change by means of support, advocacy, and resources relevant to the African American community. I am so excited today to host our first of several podcasts coming out of the State Office of African American Affairs. The purpose of these podcasts are to discuss with you, the Black community statewide, issues we face while still trying to navigate through the COVID-19 pandemic. Please note that none of these opinions discussed today or for future reference are the opinions coming out of the governor's office and or the state offices throughout New Mexico. These are strictly out of here. Prior to me turning over to our esteemed facilitators, allow me just to give you a few announcements and some of the current data. As most of you know, that we had to postpone or cancel, the Black Expo that was scheduled in June. And obviously that was due to COVID-19. Beside these various podcasts, we will conduct through June, and we will start working on a plan to support Black businesses around the state. More information about that will come soon. Most current information related to COVID-19, there are currently 3,700 overall cases with 139 deaths. Of those cases, we're talking about 2.35% of African Americans within the community. Please note that there is a COVID-19 hotline that you can reach statewide. That number is 1-855-600-3453. Now, I have the honor to turn this over to our esteemed facilitators for these podcasts, starting with, of course, Dr. Jamal Martin. Again, you all, it's been an honor and a pleasure, and thank you very much.
Good morning, Black New Mexico. It is my honor to have this opportunity, this privilege to speak to you on behalf of the Office of African American Affairs and the Health Sciences Center for the University of New Mexico. Again, my name is Dr. Jamal Martin, and I'm the Associate Vice Chancellor for African American Health, and I'm also faculty in African Studies. And what I would like to do now is introduce and pass this microphone over to my fellow facilitators.
Good morning, Black New Mexico. This is Jim Harvey. I'm the Executive Director of the Albuquerque Center for Peace and Justice, and glad to be a part of what the Office of African American Affairs has brought together and made possible for us here. It makes me happy that I can bring forward my 35 years in public health and hopefully have some things that I can share as time goes on that I think are really, really important and necessary that we all know.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, folks. Once again, I'd like to thank Director Scott Carruthers and his staff and Office of African American Affairs for giving us this opportunity. And we do have another facilitator, but unfortunately, something's happened and she's not on the line right now. Our president, I'm sure she'll do this directly. So with the time that we have, I'd like to go ahead and kick off this inaugural event. Living While Black under COVID-19. The virus actually is called SARS-CoV-2, which this is SARS 2.0. But the message for this talk is called #Equity Flattens the Curve. And one of the things that we wanted to do is talk about the things that aren't talked about in the media as it relates to this illness and its impact on people of African descent. So let me move to the next slide, please. So what I'm going to give you is just, back up to this, thank you. I'd like to give you a basic overview of basic public health practice. And I want you to understand that the difference between public health surveillance and medical surveillance is that in public health, which I'm a practitioner, we monitor health events in populations, as opposed to people in hospitals. Medical surveillance monitoring looks at potentially exposed individuals to detect early symptoms. So in one case, we're looking at entire population. In another instance, we're looking at one individual time. However, we do need synergy between these two groups. Next slide, please. So as we begin to think about this notion of screening and testing and what this disease is, what surveillance is all about, it's important to understand that in terms of health promotion, protection, disease prevention, and control, there are three strategies for prevention: primary, secondary, and tertiary. And with primary, we're looking at those who may be susceptible. And we do that because we want to reduce the number of new cases of disease. With secondary prevention, which could be testing and education, we're looking at people who are asymptomatic, who may have been exposed but don't actually have the disease or the symptoms itself. And with that, we're trying to reduce the number of background cases, okay? With tertiary prevention, we're looking at people who are already symptomatic, and we're trying to reduce those complications and prevent further disability. And these are the cases that you see mostly in the hospitals that are related to the excess deaths that are occurring in the populations, particularly people who are living with pre-existing conditions. Next slide, please. Now, I think it's important to remember, and if you could please just kind of remove the gallery view for a moment for me, please. SARS-CoV-2 is flu-like, but it's not the flu. And I think it's important that everybody understand that this is flu-like, but it's not the flu. And when you look at this particular slide that comes from CDC, you see that through their mortality reporting system, which tracks pneumonia and influenza and COVID-19, you see that the solid black line represents the number of flu cases or flu cases and pneumonia related to flu. But the red solid line that you see this huge increase in pneumonia related to this. And that's what's so problematic, because this is a novel, interesting disease in itself. And it's causing more and more pneumonias, which is what's, that acute respiratory distress is what's one of the reasons why people are being hospitalized. So you take that and add that to pre-existing condition, then it becomes very problematic. But it also shows you why we need social distancing, why we need to do the screening, why we need school closures, people stay at home, why we need hand washing and face masks, okay? Why testing and everything is important. And once again, if you could just move the gallery view for a moment for me, please. Next slide. It's important to remember that SARS-CoV-2 or SARS 2.0 is what we call an emerging infectious disease, or EID. And this is one of the most interesting things about this particular phenomenon, because the factors that are related to this are obviously human demographics and behavior, technology and industry, economic development and land use, international travel and commerce, microbial adaptation and change, and breakdown of public health measures. So all of these factors figure in with the emergence of this particular illness, this virus. But if you look to the right of this, I have a graph which shows you this notion, where we talk something called zoonosis. And zoonosis are diseases which are caused by the exposure to animals, which is passed on to humans, and what those risk factors are. And a disease such as this lies at the intersections of what's happening with wildlife, agriculture, management of illnesses, and how that happens to humans, and how these viruses and these strange viruses occur in populations. So it's a complex problem, can't be solved without partnering with other professionals from other disciplines on how we look at how this happens to humans. And when you look at the borderless factors, you see that it's not just one single factor, but all of these factors in combination that result in these emerging infectious diseases. Next. Livestock thing is important to remember. Okay, so as we talk about flattening the curve, you hear a lot of people talk about flattening the curve, and they talk about the role of mitigation. What are the efforts that we can do to minimize this? Well, with flattening the curve, we're talking about the number of daily cases on the vertical axis, and on the horizontal axis, we're talking about days since the first case. And so you see, with the sine curve that you see those without protective measures and how the numbers arise with the number of daily cases. But with protective measures, the cases, is flattened. And what I want to get at through this message today is that this is more than just flattening the curve from this virus itself, because we have not addressed the conditions which caused it in the first place. So if you look to the left of the screen, you'll see that I have something that is called the R0 scale. And it's the average number of people that one person with the virus infects based on the scale. And as you see the top of the scale with COVID-19, one person who may be infected with the disease infects an average of 2 to 2.5 people per person, as opposed to H1N1 flu, if one person is infected, it only affects maybe 1.5 persons. Ebola, if one person is infected, they affect 2 people. And with SARS, 2.4, 2 to 4 people, and MERS, which is the Middle East respiratory syndrome. So this is a very unique illness in the fact that one person can infect at least 2 to 2.5 more people each time, which is why we need the distancing and the other measures in place. Next, please. The Anthropocene. As we talk about these emerging infectious diseases, one of the things that's really bothersome to me is that these diseases happen because of what we have done to this earth in our epic. And as you look at this epic, you'll see that we have really threatened human security in terms of water, food, energy, health, income, livelihoods. So we have human vulnerabilities. We have societal stability, issues with conflict sensitivity in terms of political events, migration, violence, conflict, cooperation with institutions, climate system issues in terms of temperature, precipitation, extreme weather, ice covers, and natural resources. So with all of this, you'll see that we have environmental vulnerabilities, human vulnerabilities, conflict sensitivities, and climate sensitivities. So when these are added to these emerging infectious diseases, I want to say that we can expect to see more and more of these viruses occurring in nature and around the globe and in our neighborhoods. So in many instances, when we look at what the state's response is, and while we are talking about New Mexico, quite frankly, folks, let me add a caveat to this. We still do not have enough data collected here on people in New Mexico. So what I'm talking about now is how I'm looking at the national and the global and how that reflects on us here locally. So we'll see that state's capacity determines the scale of these responses, how we adapt to them, and how they're mobilized. What that initial capacity is, whether we have greater technical, financial, social resources to adapt to stress to these crises. How do we adapt to the inputs of capital and social technical ingenuity, courtesy of actors, as well as how these things are compromised. And you all know that here in New Mexico, we have a very small population statewide, but we have many, many different faults and vulnerabilities that exist in this particular state. But we see a pretty good job of this right now, I may add, in terms of how this is coming together. Next. Next. Right now, I would say that what we're seeing in major urban and metropolitan areas, we're seeing more and more cases of this, and that's because of the demographics, the crowding, urban congestion, other types of things. But one thing people haven't really talked about is environmental racism. Now, people of color often live in neighborhoods and communities which are disproportionately affected. And one of the other things that we need to take into consideration are the links of the exposure to high levels of air pollution. Remember, this is a respiratory illness also too. So the relationship between air pollution from small particles and matter is 20 times stronger than that between pollution all-cause mortality and untargeted deaths. So it is important to wear your mask because of the air pollution and other types of things that are there. But by and large, I guess the bottom message for this is that highly impacted communities, environmental justice communities also need additional resources. When we look at southeastern New Mexico, for example, with the impact of the air pollution, the asthma quality and deaths and things there, cases, we know that there are increasing racial disparities. So we need to do more testing, we need to do more treatment, and we need to do other actions that are related to coronavirus. Next. Okay, so now, big part of this, basically this is about a root cause analysis. And the little formula that I have there, RCA, root cause analysis squared, is basically saying we don't understand root cause analysis. So now, when we square it, we have to talk about the action. So as we talk about this, we have to talk about structural violence and pre-existing conditions under the social determinants of health. Many people in the media are saying that African American communities are susceptible or more vulnerable, but they aren't really explaining social determinants of health, what these pre-existing conditions are, or the institutionalized racism and calling it out by name as it exists. Next. So let's be frank about this. As we talk about institutionalized racism, we have to talk about overt white supremacy, and how and what forms are socially acceptable and what forms are socially unacceptable. So if you look at this pyramid, when most people talk about white supremacy, they only look at the top of the iceberg, the tip of the iceberg. They're thinking about hate crimes, swastikas, KKK, the N-word, burning crosses, racial slurs, jokes, neo-Nazis, lynchings. But we go below the surface of this and see what's acceptable. We see making America great again. We're seeing hiring discrimination. We're seeing police murdering people of color, discriminatory lending, school to prison pipelines, Confederate flags, not believing the experiences of people of color, police brutality, Eurocentric curriculums. We're seeing the denial of white privilege, denial of racism. All these things are added to this notion of microaggressions, which cause more stresses. And all these things are byproducts that are infused in plain institutionalized racism. So, we have to assume and let people know that good intentions are not enough. And so next slide, please. So very briefly, if you look at this slide, you'll see that what I mean by institutionalized racism. The Three-Fifths Compromise of 1787, where we were considered three-fifths of a person, to the Naturalization Act that says that only 3 white persons are permitted to become citizens, which this is still a debate in America today. Like, who is a citizen, who is not a person, is a citizen. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1793 that says less use of law enforcement to return runaway slaves to their masters, the Black Code, Indian Relocation Act, the Fugitive Slave Law, Supreme Court decisions, the Homestead Act. All of these issues show you clearly that institutionalized racism is a joke. While those of us who've survived political apartheid and Jim Crow, we have to understand and let people know that while personal racism seems to have improved some, we still have not dealt with institutionalized or systemic or institutionalized racism. Next slide, please. It's in the DNA of this country. That's the bottom. That's the takeaway message there. Next slide, please. So this formula for living under structural violence, because I say that this virus has exposed all the weaknesses and underbellies of why America is not great in that sense. So we have this notion of supremacist ideology that basically says, I'm superior to you, so therefore you must be inferior. And if you're inferior, I can subjugate you or treat you badly because I believe that you're not human. And so that supremacist ideology leads to discriminatory acts, which can be cultural historical trauma, disparities, inequities, structural dominance in terms of power and privilege, the triplets of racism, which Martin Luther King talked about, racialization, materialism, and militarism, and how that leads to oppression. And 5 types of injustices, distributed injustice, how resources are allocated. Are they being allocated freely? Are testing being allocated freely in this nation? Are we skimming on that? And the procedural issues, retributive justice, punishment, moral exclusion, cultural imperialism, those are all forms of oppression. Next, please. Next. So this is kind of complicated, but I want you to understand this. As we talk about our environment and how place matters, where you live, work, play, and go to school has an impact on your life. So when our environments cultivate our communities, and our communities nurture our health. So again, where you live, play, work, and go to school has an impact on your health. If you look at the tree to the left of this diagram, you see that the tree is dying. And that's because inequities are high and the community assets are low. So health outcomes are their worst. So if you look at the roots of that tree, you'll see adverse living conditions, segregation, marketing of tobacco and alcohol, environmental toxins, unemployment, discrimination, institutionalized racism. And the tree that feeds on the roots that feed on that leads to a trunk that has fragmented systems, disinvestment in communities, and the stresses, the chronic stresses from living with that are what creates the chronic diseases or the pre-existing conditions that people are suffering from in terms of substance abuse, smoking, HIV, AIDS, mortality, malnutrition, obesity, depression. Now, the tree to the right, you can see that it's thriving. And why is it thriving? It's because inequities are low and community assets are high. So the health members are their best. So the tree that's feeding on that, the roots of that tree have quality schools, access to healthy foods, access to healthcare, transportation resources, clean environments, jobs, living wages, quality housing, health insurance, issues related to access to, recreational facilities. And that leads to a stronger branch, which is a stronger community. Those disease conditions are lessened. So this is structural violence. This is structural violence. When I talk about structural violence, I'm talking about disparities, disabilities, and details that result when systems, institutions, or policies or cultural beliefs meet some people's human needs and human rights at the expense of others. Structural violence creates relationships that cause secondary violence to occur. Most of the time, if we talk about secondary violence, we're talking about self-destruction, community destruction, and national and international destruction. And these are reactions and responses to structural violence. So when we talk about alcohol abuse, drug abuse, suicide, depression, internalized oppression, crime, interpersonal violence, domestic violence, rape, rebel movements, terrorism, suicide, civil wars, revolutions, coups, those are secondary violence. We have not dealt with the root causes of it, which is structural violence, where the systems are in place and the way they've been designed not to give people their human dignity. Next slide, please. So what are the alert signs of the structural violence? Disease outbreaks, coronavirus, poverty line indicators, basic needs index not being met, unemployment, underemployment, youth without jobs, food shortages, food deserts, famine, war violence, oppression, political instability, corruption, disintegration of government institutions, and migration. People move out of rural areas to cities, to find help or need and want, and that creates more urban problems as well. So these are the alert signs. Next slide, please. So what are the effects of structural violence and racism on health systems, on health status? They can be direct or indirect. They can be latent, they can be pathways, they can be cumulative. Your early life environment affects adult health independent of intervening experiences. This is why we have to take care of our children and our youth. Because this starts early. Disease does not start when you're an adult or middle age. It starts when you're very young in the communities that we live in. So it can be pathways. The early life environment sets individuals onto life trajectories that affect health status over time. And it can be cumulative. The intensity and duration of that exposure of living in unfavorable environments and how that adversely affects the health status because of those responses. Indirect is the material interpretation or the psychosocial interpretation. It's a greater relationship between the socioeconomic position and access to tangible goods, services, and opportunities in society. What are public goods? Water is a public good. Why the heck are we paying for water? We shouldn't be doing that. Psychosocial interpretation is the direct and indirect effects of stress from being either lower on the socioeconomic hierarchy and living under conditions of relative socioeconomic disadvantage. And this gets into the whole issue as we talk about education. And it's a little sidebar note here. Education is the strongest predictor of health and well-being, but we are told to believe in this country that education is about the creation of wealth. And that is untrue. That is antithetical to our nature as an African descent people. Next slide. Next. So what happens when we live in these toxic communities and environments? We embody this stuff, and our bodies tell stories that cannot be studied or divorced from the conditions of our existence. Bodies tell stories that often, but not often, always match people's stated accounts. And bodies tell stories that people cannot or will not tell, either because they're unable, forbidden, or choose not to tell. Some of the messages that we're seeing on TV, there are some people who understand what I'm saying about institutionalized racism, but for whatever reasons, they cannot tell this in the mainstream media or say this because where they are in their careers. Next slide. So just glance at this. I'm going to give you the gist of this. As I talk about ADP, African descent people who are subjected to excessive Eurocentrism and structural racism, the context for this notion of institutionalized racism is a dominant consensus on race. And I put race in quotation marks or parentheses here because as a member of the Institute for the Study of Race and Social Justice, we said that we want people to understand that when we talk about race, we want people to understand that race is not biological. It is not biological. It is a social, political, economic construct. But racism and racialization are real. So when we talk about the context, we talk about white privilege and supremacy, and how that becomes part of our national values and becomes part of the contemporary culture, and how that manifests and leads to institutional dynamics, processes that maintain those racial hierarchies, racialized public places and institutional practices, and outcomes, racialized inequalities and current levels of well-being, and a diminished capacity for individuals and communities. And community improvement is undermined. And so the American nightmare, is 500 years of whiteness. Whiteness defined as property, possessive investment, privilege, performance, terror, privilege supremacy, and racialized social systems. So there's a contagion of fear that exists in this country as well, not only because of the virus itself, but the fear of living under this scourge of white supremacy. And it creates a culture of risk. And when we have situations like this virus or national or human-generated disasters, it leads to more shocks to the national consciousness. It leads to disorientation, and people are excessively distracted emotionally and physically. And so what you see happening under vulture capitalism, more profit and privatization taking place, and pathologies of power are strengthened, which means that over the last 30 years, when you look at what has happened in the country, you see reductions in democracy. You see how our ideology of what democracy is supposed to look like is being reshaped. You see redesigns of the economy. The tax burdens have been shifted, from the poor and the middle class onto the poor and the middle class. You see attacks on solidarity, destruction of unions. You see control of regulators. You see engineering elections. You see keeping unions in line, manufacturing consent to the media, and marginalization of populations. These all lead to ongoing racial inequalities and it leads to more chronic stressors. Next slide, please. So for the youth, as I said about this, the most vulnerable of all this, you see this trauma and socialization, leads to adverse childhood experiences. And so when children are born from conception to death, they have to live, from infancy to childhood, they have to live through these adverse child experiences. And, there's social, emotional, and cognitive impairment that takes place. There's adoption of health risk behaviors. There's diseases and disability and societal problems, social problems, and there's early death. This trauma socialization also leads to what we see when we talk about the increasing microaggressions and implicit bias that exists. So there's generational embodiment of historical trauma. We see social conditions and local context of this, complex trauma that exists. The fact that in our human bodies, there's something that's called allostatic load and a weathering hypothesis, which means we try to find some balance. But the more balance we try to find, more social toxicity exists in our communities and in other communities. So the disruptions that there's neurological in our neurological development, there's coping issues, the burdening of staff, disease and distress and early deaths. So from what we know about the social determinants of health, one zip code heavily impacts our external stressors. And again, where you live, play, and work and go to school is more important than genetic code. So we have to ask practitioners and others to say, what's wrong with you? So what has happened to you? That's what we need them to ask. When people of color come into for treatments, instead of saying what's wrong with you, they should be encouraged to ask what has happened to you, so we know the places and spaces in which they reside. Next slide, please. So chronic stresses and life events. These stresses are about uncertainty, the fear, and anxiety. And this is something every person does in terms of appraisal and exposure. And if you have the right types of personal factors and resources, you have good stress, which is a good thing. But if you don't, there's more distress and chronic and stressor response. And that leads to coping and intrusive thoughts. Smoking, alcohol abuse, adherence, compliance, and suicide. You can see the slide. Next, please. Again, how social toxicity gets under the skin. Next, please. I mentioned this notion of trying to find this balance in our human bodies. Next. This is an important slide, the iceberg effect of COVID and SARS-2. Why stay in place is necessary, and nasopharyngeal test is necessary. When people are exposed to this, if you look to the right of this, the host response, you see that some people may be exposed without infection. And some people have infection without clinical illness. That's called subclinical disease. Once they pass that solid black line, that bar, that leads to clinical disease, which is moderate to severe severity or mild illness, or with the worsening conditions in their neighborhoods, you find more and more clinical and severe disease and then fatalities. That's the host response. What's happening on the cell level is that this virus, below the black solid line to the left, you see exposure without cell entry. That is incomplete viral maturation, depending on nutrition and stresses and other types of things. You have more discernible effect with cell dysfunction, cell transformation, and the death of the cell. So this is a vicious little bugger that's out there. Next, please. Next, let's just skip this right now in terms of the immune system. Next. Next. Super. Next. I'll let you go ahead and sit there for a moment, then we'll come back. Next. And I'll make sure these slides are available for folks later on. Next. 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 Okay. African American community action. I want to give you a couple of community examples. And remember this phrase, #equity flattens the curve. Again, it's not just us working with the disease itself, but the equity throughout all the systems. Next slide, please. We're all in this together, even if we're apart. Next. How equity flattens the curve. Keep in mind historical and cultural trauma, the slave health deficit, negrophobia, pigmentocracy, identity due to dislocation, pathologies of power, structural violence, stigmas of institutionalized behaviors, post-traumatic slave dysfunction deficit, and those types of racist-related stresses that are stemming from institutions. Next. Next. Equity is the key here, where people, place, and power matter. Equalities does not mean justice. Equality means sameness. It does not mean equity. Equity means justice. And if you look at this slide very carefully, you see that some people have less. So that means they need more resources and access to those public goods in order to thrive and have human dignity. Next. Frameworks of equity and justice. We have to think about community issues. We have to think about responsible state, public welfare, and social justice, what's good for us. Next. Next. Identity issues. Just take a quick glance at this and see that we're on this evolution where we're under this hammer of European suggestions about how we're inferior and deemed inferior and how they react to us and how we need to self-motivate and identify in terms of a greater sense of consciousness. This is why Africana studies is really important. Next slide, please. Next. 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 I'll talk about the fear network later. Next. Okay, stop right there. No, go back. these are the final important points I want to bring up to this. African American communities, we have to remember that we're resilient, and we have to meet what those community responses are. This is not our first rodeo. The Free African Society, FAS, provided mutual aid, social economic guidance, and medical care community service projects in 1793 during the yellow fever epidemic, when white people were fleeing Philadelphia. They thought that, well, black people are immune to this, so they let us go. But white colonists abandoned Philadelphia. But Richard Allen and Absalom Jones, the founders of the African Methodist Episcopalian Church, served as nurses and aides, and they worked through the Free African Society to provide the benefits so the community could be sustained. And you can go back and you can look at the book that they wrote in 1793, a narrative of the proceedings of the black people during the late and awful calamity of Philadelphia in the year 1793. Benjamin Banneker himself even wrote about the accounts of the yellow fever epidemic and what black people were doing in order to maintain their communities and survive. In 1918, the pandemic of 1918, there was a belief that the flu will take a lesser toll on African Americans, and again, we were left on devices. But again, continued activism, black communities started their own hospitals and mutual care societies, cleaned up their environments, did things to overturn these theories. So we have a history of doing this, folks, and we need to remember that. And you have to go back and look at some of the things that W. Du Bois did in the Health of the Secret, the Negro American, where he documented the poor health status and talked about the underlying causes of social toxicity, that it wasn't their biology, but it was the environments in which they lived in. He did this in 1906. And his ideas contributed to something that Booker T. Washington put into action that started the Negro Health Movement Week that survived for a long time. So next slide, please. I'm running out of time here, but so what I think is these as we talk about institutionalized racism, we have to follow the examples of Charles Hamilton, Houston, Thurgood Marshall, the work they did with breaking down Jim Crow laws. And so we have to do the same thing in healthcare and institutions. We need laws that influence outcomes mediators. We need to work with laws that establish powers and duties and structure public agencies, and laws that are incidental to this. Because better health faster for all comes through when we take on the policies upstream. Next case, please. Next slide. This is more than, yes, it's important to treat people, but as we evolve with this, we see that as we move from just talking about individuals and clinical care and talk about communities and society institutions, health quality of life improves as we move beyond clinical care, health promotion, prevention, public advocacy, and give people living wages and jobs and housing and education. Health improves then. Next slide, please. We have to think about this as human rights, as Malcolm X and Martin Luther King said. Next slide, please. You see health in all policies and actions. And remember and force the state to remember and fulfill their obligations in terms of respecting, protecting, and fulfilling their obligations. So a health rights-based approach is really necessary. The human rights-based approach is necessary. Next. Next slide, please. Next. Again, very simple thing about community prevention. Action community engagement. These are all documented by WHO, by CDC. The Association of State and Territorial Health officials tell us what policy guidelines are for environmental health and housing, food, transportation, water. The National Association of County and City Health officials, we should be working with them as a community, work in our communities and do that. Next slide, please. This model is the eco-social model that talks about the individual, interpersonal, organization. My last take-home message really is about using this structural process outcome model to refer to how we undo institutionalized racism by thinking about process and outcomes. Next slide, please. And I'll get to that in a moment. We have to move beyond this lifeboat scenario about trade-offs between collective good and individual rights. Next slide, please. Okay, how do we undo institutionalized racism and administrative evil? We have to work at the individual level. Most people are comfortable there by trying to change staff members' attitudes, beliefs, and behaviors. Let's do implicit bias testing, let's do cultural competence, all that. And I think is well and good, but we have to talk about systems and organizations. So we need to think about points number 2 and 3 there, and how we look at the operations of institutions that their internal climate, policies and procedures, how that includes staff relationships rooted in hierarchical power relationships, and how we decrease psychological empowerment and either promotes powerlessness among staff and clients, and the extra organizational level. How do we, because they control access to resources, opportunities, and services, and influence communities and public policies, regulatory, economic, political, professional, and it shapes those social, political, economic contexts. So we have to work upstream. We have to change policies, put new policies in place, or change the ones that exist that are that are inherently evil. Next, please. Next, let's just move beyond that, and we're just going to close out. We think that prevention is better than cure. We have to strengthen individual knowledge and skills. We have to promote community education. We have to educate providers, foster coalitions and networks. We have to change organizational practices. We have to influence policy legislation. Next. Next. I'm mapping out this to give to people. So I do this for the generation that's coming behind me, and we'll have some Q&A and references upon request. And for those who want to get more involved in community building and community engagement, working with the Office of African American Affairs, other community-based organizations to come together as one unit, solid in solidarity, one unified community to do what we need to do, because we can do that best when we can take control of our own lives and come to power. Thank you very much, folks.
Thank you, Dr. Martin. And I think at this point we want to go to our Q&A. And so if you are typing in your questions, we will see them on the screen and we'll respond in the order that we see. We have the first question up.
Okay, and thank you, Dr. Martin and Jim, for all of that information today. At this point, any participants that have questions, if you guys can go ahead and type that in the chat box, we'll get that up and we'll read. While we're waiting for you guys to do that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Tanya Covington.
I just wanted to say hello and thank everybody for joining this podcast today. As you know, this is the first time that we're doing this, and I really hope that you get the word out to other Blacks all over the state of New Mexico and even beyond, and let them know that this is going to be happening every Monday. There'll be a different speaker on a different topic, and we really appreciate you all joining us and have your questions ready. Thank you.
Thank you, Tanya. All right, the question comes from Stephanie MacGyver. She said, can you put that question back up again? Right. Dr. Martin did say that the slides will be made available. But we had a question from Stephanie MacGyver. That up again. Okay.
Oh,
I think everything's okay. Dr. Martin. The question that was posed is something I said that the X, Y, and Z was the antithesis. Let's see if I can pose this right. Trying to paraphrase the question again because it flashed so quickly. Let me put it this way. I think this is why Africana Studies is so important to us as a people in Africology. We are living in an environment that was not created by us or for us. The famous historian and educator, Dr. John Henry Clark, and Carter G. Woodson once said that we were not brought here as slaves and kidnapped, brought as slaves to be educated. We were brought here to be servants for these folks. And so we have a system of education and oppression that is not of our own making. And therefore, we're living under this notion of Eurocentrism, where the only way we see this world or view this world is through the lens of Eurocentric eyes. And we know that there are inherently a great deal of challenges in that because, quite frankly, we cannot embrace white supremacy, the very basis of that notion, that we are inferior and that they are superior. And so we have to, it's the same reason why 50 years ago we fought for Black Studies programs, Africana Studies programs, to understand our culture, our history, our identity, our way of looking and understanding the universe, our system of ethics and values. It's just not European in that way. It's not based upon that. And forgive me for rambling about this right now because I think that I want to make that very part of the conversation. The next talk that I do for this group is we understand that. So, Dr. McIver, if you want to reach out to me again first for that conversation, I'll be more than happy to talk about that because I think that's something critically important in light of what's happened recently with Africana Studies and the hate crimes and racism that's been directed at that program recently. So let's talk about that very soon. There's lots of other questions there.
The next question is definitely not a dumb question. It's one that needs clarification. That is there a difference between COVID-19 and coronavirus?
Well, what I want to say is that when we talk about COVID-19, we're definitely talking about a condition, the disease condition. Coronavirus, which there are hundreds and hundreds of variations of this particular virus. This particular virus we're looking at right now, those of us that understand virology also relate to it or call it officially SARS-CoV-2. So this is a new variation of SARS, severe acute respiratory distress syndrome. This is a new variation of that coronavirus. So there are hundreds of coronaviruses, but this is just the newest iteration of that particular virus, and it is a nasty little bugger in the sense that people are much more vulnerable in some ways, have increased opportunities for developing acute respiratory distress syndrome and dying of pneumonia respiratory failure. So one is the disease and the other is the actual virus in terms of scientific research and naming viruses and things, okay? But COVID-19 is something that was just picked up as a general descriptor that the media has used and propagated. And but people in the science world say, okay, this is SARS-CoV-2. And but I would say that COVID-19 is actually the disease process which keeps us in the hands of medical professionals and away from public health actions in some ways as well too. I know people will disagree with that, but I stand by it. All right. Next.
Okay. So next question. Vaccinations will be critical in defeating this pandemic. However, our history of encounters with the health community and vaccine programs is clear, traumatic, and devastating. What are your recommendations for how this program could be applied to our community? And trusted messengers?
That's a good question because I think we're still a good 12 to 15 months away from a vaccine that'd be effective in this and what that would look like. And I really wish I could have talked a lot more about that also too in terms of the science part of that. And I tell you the truth, I really don't know how many African Americans are clearly anti-vaxxers, but I do know this. And there's certain vaccinations that I know that I didn't want my children to have because I didn't like the risk of them. But for the most part, vaccines are effective and they can work. I'm of age where I grew up, I saw children with polio when I was a kid. I saw paralysis and I saw the people on life support systems because of polio. So I do understand the importance of vaccine programs. My biggest concern about vaccines is that for them to be more effective in my mind's eye, is that we have to undo scientific racism that exists in the health profession and science at large also too, to ensure that everyone is not drinking the Kool-Aid in terms of producing these things and that they are safe and effective and do what they need to do. But vaccines alone aren't going to really do this. It's not going to be that magic bullet or panacea, let me put it that way, for the inequities that exist. So I think we have to get away from that. And again, I'm more than happy to talk to people, bring more detail about that one as time allows. But it's much clearer picture than that. Again, we have to stop people from just dealing with surface similarities and let's go into deep structure. Let's solve the problem. What is root cause analysis of much of this? So again, vaccines alone, and medicine alone will not solve this problem.
But who would we consider some of the trusted messengers?
Who are the trusted messengers? I think that's going to depend community by community, who people, who they trust in their communities and who are those, who they choose to listen to this. But it also shows that in many ways, those up in the ivory towers and other places have not done a good job of being involved in our community life because we've been affected by this Eurocentric learning that says, everything that we've learned is about our promotion and not giving back to our communities. So, and that's a dig really at the system, not people involved in it so much. But some people trust their families, some people trust their friends, some people trust, the religious faith-based communities. I think communities, by and large, different neighborhoods, are going to have to sort of come together and have the communications and discuss what they want, what they need, and communicate that to other people. Yeah, wear wolves in sheep clothing, I guess I would say on that.
Do you have any more questions? It's not. Tanya, do you have anything you want to add at this point? Can you unmute, Tanya?
Oops. Okay.
Yeah.
We've been coming up with topics for other sessions, and if anyone has any suggestions, feel free to, you can email me personally at tonyacovin@aol.com, and I'll put that also in the chat, and let me know. And again, please spread the word, because we would like to have as many people attend these podcasts as possible.
Tanya, do you have the list of the topics that we have in queue so far?
Yes, we're going to be talking about things in pretty broad categories. We're going to be talking about where to get masks for our community, and hopefully make a nationwide, a statewide sort of thing where people are going to be making masks for Black people all over the state. We're going to be talking about several different legal issues about whether or not, what happens if somebody gets pulled over or whatever because they're wearing a mask. We're going to be talking about Black businesses. And can you not hear me?
Yes, go ahead.
Oh, okay. We're going to be talking about how to support Black businesses. We're going to be talking about health and well-being. We're going to be talking about the importance of the census and how that affects the money that we get for healthcare. So we've got a number of subjects, and like I say, anyone who has subjects particularly that they want us to address, please contact me.
Great. We're also going to be talking about interpersonal violence. Interpersonal violence, and it was mentioned in Dr. Martha's presentation, and I think that's something that we need to tease out, because we're talking then about domestic violence, we're talking about sexual violence, rape, we're talking about violence on the streets, violence in the stores, violence in traffic, other ways that we express our frustration and our anger, and people that have a propensity towards violence towards one another. So we're going to talk about that in as broad a sense as we possibly can. Let's see. Here's another message. The New Mexico Black Mental Health Coalition has a drop-in online support group for parents. We'll be getting these sorts of resources. We'll post these and as many other resources as time goes by. But we want to make certain that you have as much information as possible. We also want to make certain that you have access to as many of the resources as we can get out there to you. New Mexico Black Mental Health at gmail.com for further info. Thank you for that, Stephanie.
Can I interject and say something else again here? As I'm thinking about this, one of the last questions that was posed to me was really about, trauma, devastating effect that the suicides and system and structural racism has had on us, particularly through the medical industrial complex. And I had a couple of slides there that really sort of talked about brain functions, which has been a big part of my work in terms of social cognitive neurosciences and what have you. But you have to understand that in terms of trust, where this goes is that once people have perceived that there's a threat, and a perception of threat, Very simply, folks, people always know that we either fight, run away, or freeze and do nothing. And the more we're exposed to that particular threat, the more our body produces neurochemicals to respond to that particular threat, cortisol, norepinephrine, et cetera, et cetera. And problematically, we are always then sort of looking for that threat, that perceived threat, and we never have the opportunity to move to the forebrain where dialogue, language, problem solving takes place. So we're always more reactive than proactive. And so that's one of the cycles that we have to break in order to trust. There are some things in the system that are good, but we need to have more of a filter for much of this as we go through this. And so with that, how do we undo, this notion of the contagion of fear? When the fear network takes place, and Amidala is responding to this, we're always back into that loop again, where we're constantly looking for the perception of that threat. And for children, it's particularly more dangerous in that sense because the more they perceive a threat, the more trauma that they experience on that level, it shrinks the hippocampus of the brain, which affects learning and memory. That becomes problematic. But on the other side of this, as we talk about amygdala, that part of the brain, which is responsible for the fear network and emotions that take place, some people respond in ways that they lose their intellectual empathy for social justice when that fear network takes over. And I think that's part of one of the reasons with white supremacy in that sense. There's a great deal of fear there that whiteness brings about in people. And so some people, when that fear network is activated like that, people become sociopathic in nature. They don't care about anything but themselves in that level, which is why you see the hoarding and all the other things that are taking place. Why is it that people are more concerned about what comes out of their body than what comes into their body during an epidemic? When you think about it at that level, people rush to buy more toilet paper and other things that are concerned with coming out, but not what may be coming in with the virus itself. So that fear network is an important thing to understand and deconstruct as we try to come forth with health interventions and health versus disease prevention issues that allow us to become more empowered through our own understanding of our own identities and us as an African people, and not falling prey to the stigmatization of the things that have been placed upon us. This is another whole big dialogue that needs to take place.
Right. And at this moment, I want to go ahead and thank everybody for their time. I want to thank Dr. Martin and Jim and Ms. Tanya for all of the information that they provided today. I do want to let the participants know that we have a YouTube channel. So if you are going to if you want a recording of this, it will be posted tomorrow. If you just type in Office of African American Affairs on YouTube. Next week's topic, it is in the chat. It's going to be what to do if you haven't been treated fairly. And our expert is going to be Eric Nixon. And if you guys have any questions that you guys want to send in beforehand, you can do that at admin.oaaa@state.nm.us. And like I said, that is in the chat. So again, we want to thank you guys for your time, and we hope you guys will be able to tune in next week, same time.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.